just this question alone gives us a lot of insight into, what, probably the premier sort of third-party company working on games for the PCFX.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the PCFX Fan Club podcast. I'm Benjamin Yoder with my co-host here, Matt, also known as Play Yongo on the Discord and on YouTube and things like that. And we have a really exciting episode today, I think. We had a unique opportunity to interview somebody who actually worked on PCFX software in the past, when the system was alive and contemporary, right? And that guest we have today is a fellow that online goes as Babo. And Babo worked at a company called HuneX, which if you know, previously we talked about HuneX. And they, in a lot of ways, kind of act as like a first-party developer for the PCFX. They were like a joint venture between like Human Entertainment and NEC. And they developed a lot of the key software for the platform. Blue Breaker, First Get Story, did some ports with Welcome to Pia Carrot, Matt's favorite PCFX game there. And so they're like a really, in my opinion, a very important company to the platform. And Babo basically went ahead and did graphic design work for the company, essentially. Is that would you say that's the right way to put it? Maybe pixel art work, maybe? I don't know what the exact term would be for that, but
yeah, I think he described himself as a graphic designer, but yeah, like graphics artist.
Yeah. I think if I remember correctly, like one of the things he mentioned, I believe before we talked to him, was he as like a test thing when he came into the company, he worked on the little character sprites for Welcome to Pia Carrot, which I believe is like a PCFX specific edition that happened.
Actually, I believe those are present in the PC98 version. Like there are little animated sprites. Like when you perform a job or something like that, they'll like go through the motions of sweeping the front of the store, or like cooking or something like that. But yeah, no, that's what he said was one of the early things he did, and they're super cute.
But yeah, so he joined the company actually kind of maybe to the back half of the PCFX lifespan. I believe it was like kind of like early 97, which if you don't know, the last PCFX game was around like April 98. So it's about the last year of the system's lifespan. But he worked on a lot of interesting things there. So today, what we had the opportunity to do was to go ahead and ask him a series of questions about his time at HuneX, get his thoughts on various things on the PCFX, have him share some fun development stories and things like that. And yeah, so we're going to go through those questions today and basically kind of read them off and then provide our thoughts and feedback on the information that he gave. So I'm thinking what we're going to do for the format of today's show basically is we're going to go ahead and basically read out the questions that we asked Babo, and they're basically around 10 questions, although we're going to probably cut some for time. And we'll have the response basically read out so you guys can hear that, and then we'll go ahead and basically have a quick discussion about kind of all the points that he responded with in that. And just as a quick interjection here, Galaga from the community will be doing the narration for us. So thank you, Galaga, for taking the time to read Babo's responses in English. So our first question that we asked Babo was, the PCFX had been out for a few years by the time you started with the company. Was there still a feeling of optimism about working for games on the system? Did Hudson and NEC still feel supportive of PCFX game development? And then this was Babo's response.
I felt like there was still a positive vibe around the PCFX when I joined HuneX. Hudson never came up in internal conversations, so other than providing development tools, I don't think there was much of a relationship. I think NEC HE was in a cooperative relationship with us for Anime Freak and the like. However, as a lowly employee, I received almost no information about the direction of the parent company. Additionally, for the parent company Human, a console that only sold tens of thousands of units, they'd look down on it, right? Today, a brand that is sure to sell tens of thousands of units with a fixed fan base is very valuable. But at the time, a hit title on the PS1 or other platforms could sell hundreds of thousands of units or more, so they probably made light of it.
Yeah, so I mean, this is kind of coming from our perspective as, fans of the PCFX outside of Japan who are, English speaking natively. We really want to know, like, kind of what the perception of the PCFX was like. And I think that just this question alone gives us a lot of insight into, probably the premier sort of third-party company working on games for the PCFX, like, at least from an employee's perspective, what that was like.
Pretty much most of the back half of the PCFX library was HuneX's work at the end of it. Like, they were probably the last developer to touch a PCFX dev kit directly, right?
Yeah, so. Yeah. And I think one thing that's interesting about HuneX too is a lot of their stuff is, I feel like, the kinds of games that form the identity of the PCFX in a lot of ways to me. Some of the games that I've really enjoyed playing too. I mean, you have things like the whole Anime Freak FX series, but things like, Blue Breaker and the port of Pia Carrot and First Kiss Story and things like that, right? So, you have this console which clearly didn't sell a ton of units, right? But from this developer's perspective, right, definitely for HuneX, it was worth it for them to be developing on the system, right? And it sounds like too, like, there wasn't, because I feel like we have this perspective also that, like, there was possibly kind of heavy-handed interference, right, from parent companies and things like that. Yeah. And obviously, as a graphic artist, like, they might not have insight into, sort of the instructions from above type of thing. Yeah. But it's nice to at least hear that, I don't think that there was as much of that type of interference, at least within the company internally, that could be felt. As, I think people outside tend to assume, right? It's an assumption, maybe based on rumors and things like that. And I think it's nice to hear kind of directly from someone that was working there, just more about what it felt like for, just in terms of, like, how much support they were getting for what they were doing.
Yeah, I think what's interesting to me about all of that is, like, he mentioned the fact that, like, Hudson really only provided the development tools, but, we already know by, if you know the PCFX lineup when things came out, like, the last game I think Hudson put out was, like, Power League in 96, right? Mm-hmm. And then, by 1997, they were doing Saturn and PlayStation games. So they were already gone, basically. So at this point, they basically were just, I don't really 100% understand the whole, like, Hudson involvement in PC Engine even. Honestly, I mentioned before, I'm not, like, a huge PC Engine fan. But it sounds like they work with NEC on both these platforms to some extent. And in this case, it looks like they made the development tools. And then Human is maybe the other interesting thing, because if you don't know, Human and NEC were the ones who, combined to make HuneX, essentially. That was a joint initiative, basically, between them, as far as I understand. And then, I'm kind of fascinated, like, the fact that, like, they're like, we have this parent company that actually doesn't really like what we're doing over here, but also, to some extent, they're, like, connected to NEC, and NEC seems to still be supporting, like, all this stuff. Like, the back half of the whole PCFX library is basically almost all NEC published games, right? And, like, NEC, at the very least, seems continually interested in supporting this platform for whatever reason, whether it be making money back on an investment that they made, and they're like, well, at least we can get something back from this if we keep publishing games, or if they viewed it as some other successful initiative in terms of just, like, that type of game space they're trying to get into or like invested in, I guess, maybe. Like, I don't really know what NEC's motivations were here to continue to funding these things, but it's funded the system for a good 3-4 years, which is not short, right? Like, that is a pretty long investment, probably well after the PCFX was going to be any sort of, like, larger term success beyond that, right? So it's like really interesting to like hear about that kind of intersection between these companies and like how they all feel differently about this system, like through the perspective like what HuneX was feeling about that. The one thing that did come up, and like I didn't want to include this question because it really didn't do much, but previously when we were initially conversing with Babo, is he had mentioned when he joined the company, it was right after they had wrapped up Blue Breaker. And apparently a large number of staff left after that. It sounds like probably there's like maybe some kind of crunch period that happened. And then maybe some drama in that crunch period. He said he didn't seem to really know anything about that drama. But he was like, it's kind of like a rumor that basically went around when he joined the company. Like all this stuff happened beforehand. So it seems like there probably was maybe some, I don't know if bad blood is the right word, but there was not, it wasn't like happy good time all the time at HuneX with that stuff. It sounds like there was a lead up to where he was at, but like at the end of that system, it sounds like it was maybe a relatively positive view of the PCFX, despite those troubles that they had with Blue Breaker.
Yeah, and that's another thing that I find interesting too about his story is just the timing of when he was hired, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, being hired sort of toward the later end of the kind of PCFX's lifespan when HuneX is still doing a whole bunch of development for the PCFX. And it sounds like, Blue Breaker, just sort of internally, rumors at least, may have had a bit of a troubled development. I feel like that's another thing that just kind of shows the sort of internal support and health of HuneX as a company and, as a PCFX developer.
Yeah, that kind of leads a little bit into our next question here, where they actually talk a little bit about kind of HuneX's, I guess, to some extent, financial circumstances with the PCFX and like how they viewed the system. So you want to read that question?
Yeah, sure. So, we asked, did HuneX consider any PCFX games to be successful products? Did the customer install base limit the scope and style of games the company could develop for the PCFX? So this is what Babo has to say about that.
I don't think any of them could be called a blockbuster hit at the time since the hardware didn't sell a lot of units. So there was a limit to the amount of software that could be sold. However, it seems like most of the software sold tens of thousands of copies since there were many enthusiastic fans. In baseball, the PCFX would be like an average hitter who doesn't hit many home runs but has a good batting average. In regards to the second question, I don't know much about the decision on the genres of software to be developed. Such things were decided by the upper management of the company.
So maybe in a lot of ways, actually, like HuneX's success here, or at least this mentioned success of like, basically successful smaller scale games, I think largely fits well with like the image of the PCFX, right? Of just like, it's a hardcore fan base console for people who are really dedicated to these, anime brands and like, into like what are anime voice actors doing, right? What are all these, companies doing? That's why we have Anime Freaks discs that are digital magazines, because people who are most interested in that stuff are spending money on these things to learn more about, their favorite franchises and stuff beyond just what they're watching, on TV with an anime or playing with a game directly, right? And so it feels like the PCFX, kind of embodies that in some ways. And HuneX was like, it's cool that HuneX was able to like find success and not just be like, we're supporting this console because we have to. It is an actual like success story for them to some extent for that.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I think I've made this comparison where the PCFX in this capacity reminds me a lot of the PlayStation Vita, right? Mm-hmm. And I think, that's an example of a console that also, probably didn't sell the kinds of numbers that Sony was looking for it to be really successful and for them to continue doing it. But, when the Vita came out, I think they found that they weren't able to create the kinds of games that they wanted to on the Vita initially, where you had things like, the Uncharted game that came out, where it was pretty much developed, much more like a full-budget PlayStation 3 game. And you could play that on the Vita. The hardware was capable, but the kind of install base wasn't necessarily there. Yeah. And, eventually, though, you did have, companies like Atlas come in with, Persona 4, right? Which was like a port. And it was hugely successful on the system. I forget what the attach rate was on that, but it was something like really impressive. And so I think like the Vita kind of found its audience and found the kinds of games like, publishers and developers found the kind of games that they could have success with on that system. Games that were ports maybe didn't have to have as much development budget put into them, or, anime style games. I think you had a ton of, RPGs and adventure style games on the PS Vita. So, I just sort of look at this and I'm like, I had a Vita, right? Yeah. And I really enjoyed getting games for it. I think that's one of the metrics is that attach rates were really high on this system anyway, because people enjoyed buying games for it. So it sounds like that's kind of what you had with the PCFX. And I think that's, it helps me as somebody who, has had that experience as a Vita owner to understand more what it was probably like for, the PCFX at that time.
And one thing that's maybe worth mentioning too, and like a part of me like doesn't know how much I should bring this up, because I don't know how much like our typical audience might know about this kind of stuff, but like character goods are a thing, right? It's still a thing with things where basically you have some series that comes out, anime, today maybe VTubers might be in this category and things like that, like virtual, anime YouTuber kind of things. And like you have this character that is put out by this company and has a story, and some people kind of latch on and like take that, like that character in some ways becomes a part of their life, and then they end up investing lots of money into this character. So things like the last release on the PCFX, First Kiss Story, and Blue Breaker, which we mentioned before, they're selling merchandise around this stuff as well. And so unfortunately we didn't ask Babo about this, but there is definitely the possibility that like even if a game didn't get where it needed to be profitable, those other revenue incomes coming in from these other character goods would also be profitable as well, because the people who are buying First Kiss Story on the PCFX probably are buying like $200-$300 or more of random other stuff, whether it be a phone card or like I'm trying to think of exactly what other First Kiss Story stuff there is. There's a lot of them. Drama
there
CDs, photo discs, things like that.
Art books and things like
books.
that.
I got art
yeah,
books there.
desktop. desktop accessories and things like that. Yeah.
And so, like, that stuff can, like, bring in extra money. This is not related to PCFX, so I won't talk about it too much, but I have a series I'm interested in called Buddy Mission Bond, and it did not sell very well if you look at, like, the actual game numbers. But, you get someone like me who's like, I love this, and I may have spent $60 on the video game, but I spent $300 on various Blu-rays and merchandise and other things. So it's like you're getting more money out of that core audience in a lot of ways. And I think that like kind of the back half of the PCFX definitely feels a little more defined by that in terms of what they were doing with Blue Breaker and First Kiss Story at the very least.
Yeah. And I don't know if this factors in, but it might be slightly more of a foreign concept to us, like in North America, for instance, also because there is this kind of scale, right? Where I do feel like sometimes things kind of need to be more popular in order to make it worthwhile to make goods and things like that, because like we have just such a like larger distribution networks, right?
Yeah.
So I feel like sometimes like kind of counterintuitively in Japan there ends up being like more of an opportunity to do smaller runs of niche stuff that only a core group of fans are going to purchase. But, and I think something that like I didn't realize, as much until we started doing these podcasts is just how much merch there is for, some of those, like First Kiss Story, for instance, like there's a bunch of stuff.
And to kind of mention what you mentioned earlier about like there being like a more limited scale. I mean, I know there's a HuneX game on the PC that like, there's a all ages version and an adult version, and apparently that adult version was only sold at one event ever. And they just like that was the distribution run. They brought it to this event, they sold it. Maybe they had some extras in a warehouse that they got rid of somehow other way, but that was it. And then the rest of the versions that are out there, all the all ages versions. So there's definitely like if it can work and they can make it make sense, it's definitely a bit easier to have like everyone kind of congregate around this one event that happened where we're selling a bunch of HuneX stuff versus in the US there's just not really opportunity to do that, right? So,
yeah, it probably resembles more like the culture that we have around like Kickstarter projects and things like that now, right? I think that's kind of like the some of the first opportunities that we've had for that kind of small scale production of fan goods and games and even physical releases and things like that.
So our next question that we asked Babo was, HuneX focused on Bishoujo games on the PCFX, which if you don't know is kind of like pretty girl dating games kind of thing, right? Like First Kiss Story and things like that. Welcome to Pia Carrot. Why was this? There's a rumor that NEC dictated only anime-styled games be developed for the system. Is there any truth to that as far as you know? And the response Babo gave us was,
I don't know much about the circumstances surrounding this, but since the hardware was designed to sell animation playback functions, it seems likely that there was a bias towards software that could take advantage of this feature. Even for software that did not have animation in the original work, there were many cases where opening and event animations were added when porting.
So, I think the thing that we kind of stand by, like, and maybe this is like, we should do some more hardcore research into this at some point. There's that whole thing of like, there was a mandate from NEC that only these style games, like anime style games, were basically made. And that's, as far as I can tell, a rumor. I believe it comes from like a Nintendo Life article that sources like a magazine, and I don't know where, like, I'm talking about this off the top of my head, so sorry if this is wrong, but like I believe it's not like a hard source for that you can find very easily.
This is probably going to keep coming up for us until we can like actually disprove.
Yeah, nail it down.
Or confirm it.
But I think, at least his answer of just like, there doesn't seem to be that kind of thing, or he's not really sure of it. I think it's kind of as we expect, where it seems like there's probably more of like, the type of audience they kind of catered with Rolfie and everything like that early on when they launched her in like 95 or something like that, probably kind of led those games to that direction.
One thing to consider is that, is there evidence against this, right? And I mean, there are plenty of games on the PCFX that do not feature pretty girls, right? There's a port of, Zork, not the first one, Beyond Zork, I believe it is, on the PCFX. A very Western-styled game, Western developer, all of that. You have things like, Shanghai the Wall, right? Just a version of Shanghai. It would be very easy to have made it the Bishoujo anime girl version of Shanghai, but it's not. Baseball games, other mahjong games that aren't, strip mahjong, just all kinds of stuff like that.
I mean, a lot of the RPGs are kind of traditional sword and sorcery RPGs as well, right? Like they're not a bunch of, I mean, they're anime style, but in the way that like all RPGs from Japan had like a vague anime aspect to it visually.
Exactly.
Although maybe Boundary Gate goes against that even, honestly, because that has a more realistic style to it in a lot of ways.
That's true, but I mean, it's very much more patterned after like wizardry and things like that, right? Like the roots of that don't feel like they're from pretty girl like anime stuff, right? So I think that's one thing to look at as far as that's concerned, and. I feel like the point about animation and video playback is really significant as well, because it was an exciting technological feature of the PCFX. Its built-in video playback is really high quality. Like, it's really nice. We were just talking, I think, on the Discord the other night about the Saturn, and games that were maybe ported to both the Saturn and the PCFX. And the video playback typically is just not as good. I don't know if it's just the video codecs that the Saturn is decoding and things like that. It's just not as nice. And for developers that are making games for the PCFX to not leverage that, seems like you're missing out on a potential strong, really strong element of your game is having these really nice cutscenes. Yeah. So I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense that you see with ports to the system, a lot of times they're adding opening and ending, videos and things like that, and that you might focus on games that that feature nice animation, right? Yeah. I mean, that makes a lot of sense.
And I mean, and like as you mentioned earlier with the comment about HuneX later, like if your narrow audience wants that, and that's how you're being successful with HuneX, that's kind of inevitably the type of game you're going to make, right? Is games that are going to fill that audience that you have on the PCFX if it's being successful, right? I think there's maybe like a chicken and the egg question we could ask of like, was it NEC's initiative that brought the audience there? I mean, Anime Freaks was an very early on thing. Like where, I guess at what point does that audience get established, I guess, right? That HuneX was relying on. Like how did that happen? What steps were taken? Was it just the pure introduction of Rolfie kind of thing? Or if there was later steps that were made that just kind of concentrated this audience there? Right. But if that's the type, like if that is what you're relying on, you don't want to shake the boat too much, I think, in terms of like trying something completely out there that might draw in a PC Engine fan or a like PlayStation fan or something like that. Right.
Yeah. And we talked about this quite a bit, I think, in our previous podcast. It's still a hanging question for us. Right. But, yeah, I mean, another thing to consider is that like you definitely had a lot of Bishoujo games on even the PC Engine CD. Right. Yeah. So just from that, perspective of like what has been successful on like NEC's previous like home console, there's certainly a precedent for that style of game, on the PCFX. So we asked Babo, the list of publishers and developers for the PCFX is thin. Are you able to speculate on why there wasn't more support from the system from developers? And this is what Babo said.
My guess is that the PCFX's specs were not particularly attractive as a next-generation console. Even within HuneX, it was regarded as little more than a PC Engine SuperGraphics with video playback. And sales were low, so I believe many software developers did not find it attractive enough to enter the market. HuneX at least provided technical support for some software such as Sparkling Feather, for which I was in charge of playtesting. Though, as you might imagine, it was so long ago that I've forgotten how to beat it.
So what's interesting, I think, about this is the comment he made about how HuneX views the PCFX. David had a similar comment when he came on an interview about he kind of views it as like a souped-up PC Engine.
Yeah.
And in this case, he says more of a souped-up SuperGraphics, which I'd imagine most people here know what a SuperGraphics is, but if not, I'm probably the most ignorant person here, but I'll say it just in case I get something wrong. There was like a successor to the PC Engine that released that had barely any games. It's like 6 games or something. I think it came out like 1990 or something like that. And I think the PC Engine, correct me if I'm wrong, was like 90 or 87 or something around that range, right? And basically, it kind of came out and it died almost immediately, as far as I can tell. They didn't really support it or anything like that. And part of me kind of speculates that like maybe the reason why the PCFX took so long to finally come out after kind of people saying that was in development for so long is because the SuperGraphics came out and they just it did kind of nothing. In a lot of ways, I think that's because there just wasn't like a big enough power gap between the PC Engine and the SuperGraphics, because the PC Engine was like a really impressive, like essentially 8-bit machine as far as I understand, right? Where the SuperGraphics brings it to the level of like a Super Nintendo or say a Genesis, but PC Engine already feels like it competes pretty well, even if it's not as good. So I feel like it was like kind of a redundant system in a lot of ways. But I thought that was like a fascinating way to kind of look at it of just like, or that they were also looking at it like that kind of just, this fairly straightforward system, but also it has video capabilities kind of put on it that we are leveraging, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that it's a good point, and that we mentioned in our last podcast as well, which is just that the competition was really stiff in this generation, right? Mm-hmm. So the PC Engine CD was kind of like the biggest, most successful, and only CD platform. I mean, not only, I think I said that last time too. The Mega CD was around as well, and then you had things like the 3DO come out and stuff like that.
It's the only success story, I think, though. Well, 3DO has its own kind of weird success. We won't get into that, though, for today's show. There's Speedy Noel did a video. Go watch it.
Yes. But the PC Engine CD was successful. It drew a lot of developer support because it was doing something really unique and novel and successful, kind of just format wise. So with the PCFX, it makes a lot of sense that, the Saturn and the PlayStation came along, and, for a variety of reasons, developers just found those platforms to be more attractive. I feel like what you see on the PCFX is a lot of developers left over from the PC, that did development for the PC Engine CD, that for whatever reason, I would say just felt like that they, could find success on the PCFX as well, and found it worth their while to continue to develop games for that platform.
And I have to imagine, like, if NEC is publishing the majority of these games that HuneX is putting out, right, they're going to want to prioritize their own platform to some extent, at least early on, for that kind of stuff, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Rather than look immediately at Saturn and PlayStation, although they were starting, like, even before the PCFX was dead, Blue Breaker and a bunch of other games started coming out on other systems too, and like NEC, I believe, Human was, I think, more responsible for those versions, but.
Yeah, which makes a lot of sense. Just from what Babo has said, it sounds like Human probably, would have found it unattractive to be completely tied to the PCFX as a platform.
So for this next question, we wanted to ask about something that Babo had a bit more direct experience with. So as we mentioned earlier, he had involvement in the Welcome to Pia Carrot game, but he also did work on Blue Breaker and First Kiss Story and things like that. So this question goes ahead and asks, it compliments him first. The sprite artwork on Welcome to Pia Carrot is great. Did you feel like you were able to leverage your artistic and technical strengths working on the PCFX? Were there any limitations that held you back? And Babo responded,
"The development tool, a graphics tool, codenamed Tetsujin, I think, was very good, and it helped us a lot. I even used that graphics tool for PS1 graphics work. It was not without its limitations. For example, it was not possible to make only a part of the palette translucent, but the game designer ordered the images within those limitations, so there were no problems."
So what's interesting here, actually, is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Tetsujin. I think this is where the Iron Man name comes from, right? Like, as I think Tetsujin means, like, strong man or something along those lines, right?
Yeah, well, it literally means, I think, Tetsu, I believe, is iron. Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah. And I've seen this used in, like, a few different contexts, I feel like, and I was never quite sure what it meant. But in this case, he's, like, talking about the actual development tool. And obviously he seems unsure about it. So he's like, maybe it wasn't this. But as far as I can tell, I actually found like a Japanese post that was also like very confused about what the name Tetsujin was. And they're trying to like figure out if it's like the name of the project, or was it a hardware component, or what. But it looks like at the very least, maybe the development tools went by that name. I don't understand the development environment well enough to know like how much those things are interconnected. Would they all be called Tetsujin if you're working with Tetsujin hardware or something like that, right? But he did like extend that over to like the PS1, right, as well. So I didn't know if you had any thoughts about this, but I just realized I didn't know what Tetsujin was, and trying to do research on it, I felt like it was foggy at best.
No, I mean that makes a lot of sense. But I mean it would, I think, make sense if if the tools were called Tetsujin in some capacity, because I believe that is what the PCFX project was codenamed. You know how all of the hardware tends to go by code names until they decide on what official name is. I think what was it? The GameCube was Dolphin, things like that. So so at the very least, it's super interesting to hear that this graphics software was robust enough and not maybe tied specifically to the PCFX hardware, such that he could use it for graphics work for other platforms and things like that. And obviously, it sounds like this was probably developed internally. I guess we don't know for sure if maybe it was HuneX, but he did say, was it like Hudson maybe did some support?
Hudson provided development tools, he said at the beginning.
Yeah, development tools. So it's entirely possible that this was something developed by Hudson, codenamed Tetsujin for the Tetsujin hardware. So that's really interesting. That's a really interesting little kind of tidbit of just sort of internal development information, even if it's not completely transparent to us.
And this would be pure speculation on my part, no involvement of Babo here, but I wonder if those tools how applicable they are. Like if they're applying them to the PS1, I'm wondering if like Hudson internally was able to do something along those lines as well. Like if they were to take those tools and build on it for their base with PS1 or Saturn or something like that, right? So
yeah, they certainly could have. I mean, and I feel like this is another thing along the lines of rumors where like, I feel like people say that Sony had an initiative not to publish games in North America that weren't 3D after a certain point, right? Because like the 3D stuff was so much more successful, and whether that was top down or whether that was just like, hey, we released 2D stuff in North America and the North Americans don't want to buy it because it feels old, and everybody's excited about the new 3D stuff or not. You definitely had 2D games being developed for the PlayStation, for the Saturn, and things like that. So it's
literal PCFX games coming over as well. So
I'm
curious,
exactly.
like what those ports look like and how those ports were achieved in a lot of ways too.
Yeah.
So
the next questions mostly revolved around a game called First Kiss Story, which Ben and I both really enjoy. It was the final game to come out for the PCFX, and it's an adventure game, a romantic adventure game. I think the kind of thing that some people would just expect to see on the PCFX.
what I think is like what makes First Kiss Story stand out in a lot of ways, even maybe outside the PCFX, I could be wrong, I'm not like a big visual novel person, I haven't played that many, is just the scale of it in a lot of ways, because it features a lot of characters. I feel like, I don't remember the exact number, but it's like almost double, I think, of what you'd probably expect in most other games at this point, right? It's like 12, 13 characters or something like that. It's a lot of story arcs and things like that, and like they all feel fully featured. They all have voice acting and stuff, and like I believe this is a 1-disc game and it all fits on a PCFX CD in a lot of ways, which in a lot of ways I think it's just like a really impressive game in terms of the scale. And then also the creativity between just like you mentioned to me before that like if you skip the karaoke scene while somebody's singing karaoke, like the character will like badger you about it and be like, hey, you weren't even listening to my karaoke or something like that, right? It's like got a lot of little fun touches everywhere, I feel like, to it. It feels like something like a real passion project in my opinion. It's like,
it feels like a labor of love. And I mean in terms of like the number of characters in it too, like it's probably at least 30-40% more than something like Welcome to Pia Carrot, for instance. So here's what we asked Babo. We personally love First Kiss Story. Despite being the final game on the PCFX, First Kiss Story comes across as a fully featured game with a lot of passion put into it. Is there anything you'd like to share about the development? This is what Babo had to say.
This project was developed under the leadership of Ozawa-san, who was in charge of planning and main programming, so I think their tastes were actively represented in the project. The selection of the cartoonist for the character design and the fact that a fighting game can be played in the game were influenced by them. Incidentally, it seems that Ozawa-san is also the creator of a doujin fighting game, Joutei Senki, for the X68000. As is customary in game development, graphic designers like myself were able to free up our hands relatively early, check the game's operation, and go home relatively early. That is to say, with enough time to catch the last train. But the more the development progressed, the harder it became for scenario writers and programmers to go home. Looking at the timestamps of the files on the development server, there were files that were updated at 3 a.m., and I realized that the scenario writers and programmers had stayed overnight. What was a bit amusing was that just before the deadline, Chief Kurono, who was in charge of certain character scenarios, kept rewriting the scenario text forever, so the planner locked the directory so that he could not tamper with the files. Since Chief Kurono's position was higher, there was a bit of a clash within the company. Another time, there was a dispute when Ozawa-san tried to publish a doujinshi of production reference materials at Comic Market. He reluctantly gave up after being told by the section chief that the copyright belonged to the company.
So I would say that my takeaway from this answer is that, Mr. Ozawa and Chief Kurono were both really passionate about this project, right? Mm-hmm. And, I think that comes through in the final project. The fact that it includes a relatively fully featured like 2D fighting game that Mr. Ozawa, it sounds like, programmed, and just the fact that he tried to publish a doujinshi collection at Comic Market and things like that. That's somebody who is passionate about what they're doing, who really believes in their project and is excited about it. And
I mean, one of the things about that PC or that fighting game they mentioned, I checked in the credits. He credits himself as the main character, the main girl from First Kiss Story, Kana Orikura. That's his credit in the game. So,
that's hysterical.
Yeah.
So I mean that's yeah. I mean, you know, what do people have these days? OCs or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, all characters are technically OCs, right? But
right.
It's just whether they get formalized or not, right? That's kind of
so that's his formalized OC.
Yeah. It's interesting because you know, the fighting game influence with him working on an X68000 version of that one game, which if you don't know, Jotei Senki, if you know the like Mugen fighting game out there, it's like this weird amalgamation of a bunch of fighting game characters shoved into one fighting game. It's very much that kind of thing. So it's like Street Fighter characters, the King of Fighter characters, and they're like all recolored and like have different names. But what's also maybe worth mentioning as well with Mr. Ozawa is that like I believe he's mainly a programmer, if I recall correctly. I would have to go back and double check all this, but like from what I was looking at him online, he was mainly a programmer first and foremost. But he did go on to continue to do some writing for HuneX as well. He did I believe it was what's it called, like the Love Simulation series, so it's like a simple series game.
Yes.
As
Okay.
well.
I actually have those. Yeah. And actually, I think Babo mentioned as part of, you know, his employment with HuneX working on, well, you know, one or more of those.
Yeah.
I think Natsuhiro Celebration maybe.
Yeah. That's another one. That's on. I know there was like advertised on the First Kiss Story desktop accessory discs. They have some ads for that game. But I think that was like that kind of stuff. I need to double check the timeline, but that was around the time, I think, before Humans started filing for bankruptcy. Because that was kind of like a big shifting point in HuneX's history in a lot of ways, was when their parent company, Human, filed for bankruptcy. HuneX did not die with that. They are still a company that's relevant today. And they're around, so they survived that whole thing. But just like it changed, I think, a lot of the company. I think they laid off a lot of people around that time as well. But there is just like this kind of ongoing thing with some of the stuff that like NEC was putting out later that HuneX worked on, where they you could tell some people who were there at the PCFX time were still at the company because there's this game called Industrial Spy Operation Espionage, and the last password in the game for the supercomputer is Future X, which is, you know, the FX part of it. PCFX is Future X, and like color me surprised when I saw that, and I was like, oh, hello. So there was still, even after, you know, the PCFX died, there's still, I think, some love for the PCFX. And so in addition to Mr. Ozawa, though, I did look a little bit into Chief Kurono as well, and an interesting thing, he's actually worked on the game design for Megami Paradise 2. And if you don't know, that game has a very I don't know. I say if there's any game that maybe embodies the culture of the PCFX, it's maybe that video game in a lot of ways. There's like literally a character goods store in there with all the characters like with their faces up on, and like there's a merch section for them, and like there's not really anything meaningful in it, but you can go buy copies of Blue Breaker out of the store and things like that. It's like a very fun kind of just like I think representative of the culture of like the people who are probably interested in the PCFX in a lot of ways. So was
that the one that had the cutout of a character from Private Idol in it?
Yeah, there's the store that has May in it from Private Idol as well.
Okay.
It's just like hanging out the back. So I think that like clearly, I mean, at least there's only, I'm sure that many more people cared about these games a bunch at the company when they're working on them, but these two in particular, it was interesting to hear stories and have some names put to things and like hear about, you know, the kind of weird writer dynamic you have sometimes where it's like you never want to stop improving something and start changing something, but then it's like, no, we have to make a video game, lock it down, no more edits, Chief Kurono. So well,
yeah. I mean, that's, you know, something to consider too is, you know, if people are like, hey, was there some sort of top-down directive to like make, I don't know, some of these particular types of anime games and stuff on the system, but you know, especially when you have, I mean, we did mention even in one of our questions, like, hey, the number of developers on the system was somewhat limited, and HuneX ended up making a whole bunch of games for the system, right? Mm-hmm. You know, it's entirely possible also just internally to a company, you know, developing games for the PCFX that, like, maybe just some of the employees there, you know, like developing X kind of game, and if they're able to do that successfully on the PCFX, you know, that alone just sort of influence, especially like a library of 62 games, right?
Yeah.
It could definitely kind of have an outsized influence on the perception of, what sort of games are available on that platform.
And it might impact like the type of people who come work for the company too, right?
Absolutely.
Just like if this is the general perception of this company, this is the type of game they work on, I think, I don't know so much about Japan so much, but like I'm sure it's probably to some degree this way as well. But like in the U.S., a lot of times if you do a game job, you're kind of taking a pay cut to work on something you're passionate about, right?
Yeah.
And so, finding something that's going to be something that's fulfilling to you as well from a game development standpoint, I think matters sometimes when you look for games. I say as not a game developer, but that's always been my impression. So the next question we asked is still First Kiss Story related, and we wanted to ask kind of about the end of the PCFX's life here a little bit with this question, and that is, were you aware First Kiss Story would likely be the final game published for the PCFX? When were you informed the development would begin on platforms outside of the PCFX, and what was the reaction from the HuneX team? And Babo replied,
"At least at the beginning of development, I don't think there was any recognition that this was the final work. However, along the way, there were moves made by NEC HE, and it started to feel like this would be the final work. I think we were informed of porting the game to platforms other than the PCFX soon after development of the FX version was completed. It was not unusual for us to release a game on multiple platforms, so we were not surprised. However, Ozawa-san seemed to have a strong attachment to the PCFX, and even removed the fighting game from First Kiss Story for PS1. Although, in case you were wondering, HuneX Fighters for PS1 was also in development."
So I think like one thing that maybe I should be a little clear about before we get too deep into this question any further is that, by the end of like 1997, Blue Breaker was actually already on other platforms. They did not wait for the PCFX to be fully dead before they started porting it to the Saturn and the PlayStation. So like, I'm not sure how long the development process for First Kiss Story was, but, by the time they were reaching the end of development First Kiss Story, these games were already in the porting process, right? So it makes a lot of sense that they would already be aware that this kind of stuff's happening, and it probably would happen gradually. It wouldn't be necessarily somebody who at some point say, this is the final PCFX game, right? In a lot of ways. I think the bigger thing would be, based off whatever their next game would be, what were the development discussions about that? Because at this point, most HuneX's stuff was being developed first for the PCFX and then moving somewhere elsewhere, right? In a lot of ways.
It's interesting to look at the PCFX. It was definitely a target platform for ports from other platforms, right? Mm-hmm. But a lot of the stuff, there were a lot of games that the PCFX was the target platform, and then those games got ported to other systems, you know. And I think that those are super interesting. I think things like the Angelique series and a lot of these HuneX games, right? They were developed for the PCFX first, and then, probably sensibly at that point, especially when you're getting to the point when, First Kiss Story was coming out, ported to other systems because they just had bigger install bases and you could probably just make more money there. But did we talk about First Kiss Story? What platforms was that ported to?
First Kiss Story came out on, after this, there's the PlayStation version, and HuneX worked on that version. It's actually kind of like a First Kiss Story somewhat definitive edition. So here's the weird thing. You mentioned that Ozawa was like, I love the PCFX version, and then don't port HuneX Fighters over because that's the PCFX specific thing, despite it being in development. And I believe he's told me in the past that it was running on the system. That was like when I first interacted with them on the PlayStation. Yeah. But it was taken out. So I've always been kind of curious, how much of that might still be on the disc, right?
Oh yeah. If somebody could dredge it up.
Yeah. But yeah, it's like a plus version of the game. So there's one character story in First Kiss Story that's kind of cut short. It's a game called First Kiss Story. You don't kiss her. What is that about? You rub her leg, and that's all you do at the end of the game. So they gave her a more fully featured story, and then there's also additional graphics and things like that. They redrew some graphics as well. So I could be wrong, but I feel like the graphics in the PS1 version might have a higher resolution in general. So yeah, but there was other versions of First Kiss Story that came out later, but those were all ports based off the PlayStation version. So there was the Dreamcast version,
right? The Dreamcast version. I believe First Kiss Story 1 is included with First Kiss Story 2. Maybe only the deluxe edition. I'm not sure.
I think you're
right.
Don't
quote me on that. But.
Yeah, it's definitely a big box at the very least. I don't know if I've ever seen a First Kiss Story 2 that wasn't in that big box, or was it just being sold as loose discs. Because interestingly, those discs, if I recall correctly, they're not labeled. They're just kind of discs in a CD tray. It's very just kind of thrown in, if I remember correctly. But maybe I got a used one, so maybe it just was, that's how it just, my copy. And then the PS2 version was packaged as well with First Kiss Story 1. So, and those ports were done by M2, interestingly enough, from that. But yeah, so it is like a game that they continue to work on. I'd be kind of curious, like, what the overlap was between PCFX development wrapping up and, working on First Kiss Story PS1 and adding content, right? Like, were those happening at the same time, or was it kind of end of development, shift over kind of thing?
So our last question is basically just open-ended. We wanted to hear if Babo had any stories about the development. So this is what we asked. Do you have a memorable story from working at HuneX or on the PCFX that you would like to share? And these are the things that Babo elected to share with us.
There is a live-action rock, paper, scissors game in Anime Freak FX, and I was asked to edit the game so that the voice actors' pre-movements would indicate whether they were going to play rock, paper, or scissors. When I managed to make it look natural using video editing software I was not familiar with, the section chief said to me, "You're so adept at this. Do you do idle collages in your private life?" I also remember that in the post-editorial section of the final volume of Anime Freak FX, I included a video of the FX flying beyond the universe in hyperdrive. I created it with the concept that this was not the end, but the start of a new world, but unfortunately there was no next development. As a side note, my personal favorite PCFX software is Firewoman Matoigumi. I remember that I only got into the PlayStation version as a playtester and could only see a portion of the development. So later on I bought the software with my own money and completed the whole thing. The only addition to the PlayStation version that is useful to the player is the availability of a stun gun. As another small note, there is an anime, Rainbow Girl Squadron Prism Knights, that is serialized in Anime Freak FX. But the original inspiration for it is Rainbow Squadron Robin, that was aired in the past in Japan. I heard about this from Chief Kurono of the planning department. Also, since the character Chrono, who helps the main character, is the surname of the section chief, I wonder if it was done on purpose. It was a topic of discussion within the company.
So incidentally, my buddy and I got some of the Anime Freak discs, back when we first got the PCFX in the mid-90s. And I remember playing the rock, paper, scissors game on Anime Freak. Because that's one of the fun things that you can do as somebody who, knew no Japanese at the time, basically, right? You can figure out rock, paper, scissors. So I think that's fantastic that, he actually sort of did the cutting of the video for some of that.
We talked about it privately a little bit before as well, but I don't know what an idle collage is per se, so I tried to do a little reading into this and I couldn't figure it out. I don't think either of us are really into idol culture enough to know that, though, unfortunately.
I don't know if there's a particular meaning of it, or maybe just people that are really into a particular idol would find magazine and build a shrine to them or something like that.
I have never beaten one of those rock, paper, scissors games, I'll be honest with you. I don't know if you can beat them. It seems like it goes on forever, but if you lose once, it's over. It's done.
Oh, so. Yeah, no, that's a good point. I do feel like it probably just keeps going, but I forget.
But I feel like at some point, they give you little markers. At some point, something's got to happen. At some point, I don't know. Anyways,
it's been so long since I played it.
Yeah,
I don't remember.
The PCFX flying into the future thing I think is kind of interesting because he mentioned that he was oh, this is a new world for PCFX, and maybe came before they knew First Kiss Story was the last game they were making. But I'm kind of curious how long they were thinking about the PCFX going, but maybe it's just at the lower end of the thing, you don't think about it too much until the project's done, right? And it's what's the next thing kind of thing. So and that's from the last volume 6, which would have been before First Kiss Story came out. So
sure. I mean, at the very least, that was still part of the bright future.
Yeah. Although we did talk about this a little bit, and like we think it's probably a 1998 disc, based off the copyright on it. So it's probably, even though their website says like early 97, believe it's probably like an early 98 disc. But that stuff would have been made months ago, right? Before they put that out. So
yeah.
His work on like bug testing and stuff I thought was kind of interesting. So one thing we cut out of an earlier question just because it didn't really fit, but kind of fits here, is that he did bug testing on Sparkling Feather, which is another PCFX game, which I unfortunately... So HuneX lists Sparkling Feather as their video game on their website. Go to their website. As far as I'm aware, HuneX did not make Sparkling Feather, though. They just provided development support on it. But the company that made it, I believe, went out of business before the game came out. So I believe they kind of did the finishing touches. I heard this information somewhere. I have no idea where that information came from. It's in my brain. Don't know otherwise.
We have no source. So
I have no source.
Just rest assured, Babo is not the source for this.
Babo's not the source. Nobody's the source other than somewhere in my brain the story came from.
Ben's hallucinations.
Yes, but it was a company called Gems. So, and I tried to look into Gems and could not find any information other than the fact that they worked on Sparkling Feather. So, and I actually have an art book that is like only copyright Gem rather than HuneX, if I recall correctly as well. So,
well, it was not unusual for even high-profile developers to outsource work to other companies, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like subletting or subleasing or whatever it is, and everybody did that. So it's not that surprising to hear.
But I have a personal connection with Sparkling Feather because I suffered through that whole thing.
The whole thing.
Yeah. I 100%ed it, which maybe I shouldn't have. It's we'll get into that at some point. But yeah, that game is an adventure. So
yeah, we want every game on the PCFX to be a hidden gem. Unfortunately, that is not the case for all.
It's a fascinating video game. It is 100% the kind of video game I want to play, even if I'm not having fun. So, he also did bug testing on Firewoman Matoi Gumi.
Yeah, that actually is.
You played that.
Yes.
So I don't know about the stun gun comment. If you have any insight into that, or
well, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, it's. I find it interesting that they just added one item into the game, but I believe you can find. Oh gosh, it's been so long since I've played it. I don't remember exactly how it works, but you have different moves that you can learn. So they tend to be associated with the school club activities and things like that. So for instance, let's say you join the baseball club for a little while, then as part of your fighting repertoire, you can learn moves that are hit somebody with a baseball bat, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, I could see things like a stun gun being available there somewhere if you're part of the electronics club or the science lab or something like that. But yeah, it's we've talked about it before. It's a a school simulation with battle fighting elements and in more of an RPG-ish style battle system and dating elements. It's a really fun game. I'm not surprised that he took a liking to it.
Now, I don't know if he I don't think he specified which version of the game he bought, because he mentioned he bought it out of his own pocket, right? And he said it's his favorite PCFX game. I'm curious if he bought the PCFX version. I did not ask that.
Yeah,
and it
that's
made me think about how many people who worked at HuneX owned a PCFX in their own life. I'm kind of curious, or would the company provide them PCFXs? It's we got a warehouse question. Of these guys. Here you go.
Yeah. Well, maybe if we get a chance to ask, some questions of a developer again, we can ask.
And the last thing here as well, which is kind of interesting, is that the Rainbow Prism. Was that Rainbow Girl Squadron Prism Knights?
The PCFX show is called Prism Knights.
Prism Knights. Okay, and so Prism Knights, for people who don't know, is an OVA included with Anime Freaks, but only volume 4, 5, and 6. And there's 3 episodes, right?
Yes.
So it's kind of I think we talked about it last time, as a magical girl kind of show, but it has a bit more of an adult tone to it. I watched the last episode and people were just dying with blood.
Right.
So like
Yeah.
it definitely is not made for children, right? In the way that like some magical girl shows kind of were. But I think that was like a pretty typical thing to have more like adult oriented magical girl shows at the time, right? I don't think that was uncommon per se.
Well, I'm not sure. There certainly were things like, Keko Common and things like that. And I don't even know, like, when you had... At that time, I guess one of the things I wanted to mention is, like, Rainbow Sentai Robin in particular, if it was kind of the inspiration for this, or just loosely, based on the story or what. But that was from the 60s.
Yeah.
And I think something that I encountered a lot watching anime from the 80s and 90s is throwbacks to these old things. Or people doing, like, a new version, like a Science Ninja Team Gatchaman OVA or something.
Yeah.
Decades after the series, or even, just a handful of years after the series had stopped. So this seems like it could be something along those lines, which is super interesting.
Surface level, I will say, in looking at the old 1960s one or whatever it was, it did not look very similar in any way. So I'm kind of curious what the connections are there. More than anything, because it was like somebody in like a very, like, I don't know, skin tight suit basically, and like a little, like, I don't know, gremlin looking man that like partnered with him or whatever that would come around, and like this other series is like all anime girls kind of thing. So I'm like, how do these pieces connect? But I didn't actually like watch them in any translated form or anything like that. So I actually don't know if Rainbow Squadron Robin or whatever it's called, Sentai, whatever it is, like, I don't know if that's had any like real English exposure outside of just like there's a Wikipedia page for it. I know that much. I don't know if it tried to translate it or anything. So, well,
I mean, even just having an English Wikipedia page is like, there are things that you would think would that don't, which is odd sometimes. And not to just be like the person who reads off of said wiki page, but I'm there, so I just wanted to mention. So it does look like more recently a graphic novel that it says to be launched in summer of 2020. It is now 2023, so that
it's been a little bit since somebody updated it. So
yeah, that hasn't been updated, so I don't know if that actually came out.
Well, whoever's updating it next time, remember to include the connection to Prism Knights as well. So.
Yes, please do. So it seems like there is still at least interest in that. I'm assuming that's in Japan. It does say like Hayao Miyazaki was a key animator in episodes 34 and 38. So that's interesting. And it also says it's the first anime to feature a 5-unit superhero team. Again, this is Wikipedia. I don't know how accurate that is, but that would make it like, pre Science Ninja Team Gatchaman, for instance. And probably maybe a direct inspiration for things like that. I don't know if stuff like Voltron or something is kind of inspired by that same kind of thing, but it's interesting.
Which would line up that there's like 5 main girls, and I think they have gems embedded in them or something like that, if I remember correctly, from what I saw. Again, only like kind of passively watched and consumed it. I haven't like sat down, like I was recording it and just kind of left it be for the Prism Night. So
neither of us really know much about it, but
I did look into the Chronos guy, and it is like this really tall guy with like long red hair that the main girl has like a crush on or something like that. So
that's great.
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting for that. So but yeah, so I mean, I don't know if we like got any full story out of this, but I think we got a lot of interesting information about HuneX, right? And about, kind of what their company viewed as like a success and things like that. We got like some interesting development stories and all that stuff as well with First Kiss Story. I mean, I don't know if it's only me and you who care about that filler. I don't know how big the First Kiss Story fan base is even within our community, but I do feel like it is a important PCFX game in a lot of ways, being kind of the final last hurrah for the system, right? So yeah, I think I was really happy that with the responses we got, and of course, like, thank you to Babo as well for responding to our questions and things like that and working with us through that. Yeah, I think it's pretty rare. You probably have a bunch of Americans reaching out to you about PCFX stories, right? So accommodate us is super nice of him. So we really appreciate it. So
yeah, no, it was really a wonderful opportunity, and just to be able to, especially from our perspectives, to be able to ask like kind of the questions that that we're curious about, because the I feel like the PCFX, maybe by the time we've accomplished our goal and we've finished doing this podcast, we will have answered all of our questions. But as of now, it's a very mysterious console, and any assistance that we can have sort of demystifying it is wonderful. So I really appreciate the opportunity to ask those questions.
Anyways, thank you guys so much for tuning in this week. We really appreciate it. If you want to join our community, we have a pretty lively Discord, actually. I kind of surprised by how lively it got. But a lot of chatter in there, a lot of PCFX game talk, a lot of PCFX development talk in there as well from people, which I'm always surprised by. I don't know what any of it means, but if you want to see some insight on what's happening in that regard, there's definitely a lot of chatter in that side of things. We're always happy to hear from you guys, and a lot of times, like we the things that we hear in there sometimes are informative to us, if only to see how other people appreciate games and things like that, right? And understand like how people are approaching the PCFX from an English speaker's perspective as well, or from other regions as well. I think there's some like South America members as well in there too. So we also, if you want to get updates on the podcast, we also have Twitter and a Mastodon that will be available as links in the description if you want to follow us there. And if you do want to support us in a more like monetary fashion to help cover some of the costs of running the PCFX Fan Club podcast, we do have a Ko-fi page as well. So if you can donate there, we would appreciate that support. Otherwise, we'll be back with you guys soon with another episode. And we hope you guys enjoyed this one as well. And let us know your thoughts if you have the time.
Thanks for joining us. Please comment and subscribe.